This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave,
Happy New Year to you.
Okay, Dave on the board. It's almost Happy New Year's. It is Sunday, December 31st, New Year's Eve day, and this is the Prairie Monk Show, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails. You'd call them greenways. Not much green to be seen today. Quick weather information. The temperature outside is 15 below zero. Even if this was Celsius, that would not be comfortable, but being Fahrenheit, it's that much worse. Dave's recommendation, stay in if you can. If you have to have a party, make them come to you.
And thank you for coming in on a cold day.
Oh, sure, I took the bus. It's a brief walk to the bus stop each way.
Well, it's Christmas is over, and thousands of these poinsettias go out because that's the end of the Christmas period. I managed to salvage one. I commented to the bank that it would be sad if these go into the trash can. And they saved me one. So, and bagged it in plastic so I could bring it. And it's here in Weft, and it's going to survive for quite a little while. So we have to think about poinsettias. Well, I grew up in Australia where we were on a hill, so our back door was at grade, but the front veranda was about 8 feet off the ground. And we had 20-foot high poinsettias that you could almost swing on outside the veranda. You could look out on the veranda and you'd see a bunch of poinsettias. Rather wonderful. Okay, it's New Year, but in passing, we lost Elizabeth Bieberman. And in case you don't know Elizabeth, I had a lot to do with the curriculum lab, and her husband was in charge of the curriculum lab, Max Bieberman, and he was sort of the father of New Math. And he was a good teacher. I can remember him telling you how to finalize a debate about something. He would throw his chalk up and catch it, and that was like the end of the statement. Well, Elizabeth grew up in Pittsburgh and had a kind of Welsh background, and she got degrees and went off to Alaska for and there she was one of the very few women amongst a bunch of men. She was teaching, and Max Bieberman was teaching at the same school, and he was teaching math and she was teaching English. They got the choice to do that, and he tracked her down, and eventually they married. Had a large family, and it's prominent across the country. And I was just at the market in the mall, and somebody told me that I'd been in Meadowbrook, and I think it was Mark Bieberman from Dr. Howard. He would have me come to present Prairie, and we would go to Meadowbrook Park, and I would hide in the tall grasses and come out like a buffalo. And so somebody in the mall was telling me that their child or someone she knew was rather impressed by that visit and had been a Prairie person ever since. So the Bieberman family has had a lot of influence on quite a lot of things. So Elizabeth went with Dr. Beaman to eventually, he'd been working with Curriculum Lab, New Math, and he bridged into other curricula. He was very near to Plato on the side, and but he went to England and was doing curriculum development work there and died at a rather early age. He had a heart problem. He had one of the earliest heart valves. You could hear it as you talked to him. So Elizabeth was there. She had to come back. Her youngest child was 7. She came back, and she, for years, was doing publication work, especially with food-type books, and was a known editor for that sort of thing. She then retired from that and traveled extensively and would collect antiques and the like from Africa and come back and sell them at the farmers market and other places. And I would run into Elizabeth every once in a while. And she was 93, and this very intellectual mind actually passed with Alzheimer's, which is kind of sad, but we all face getting aged. And bully for the Beaman family, and goodbye to Elizabeth, a life well lived. Then we have a few other things here. It's been interesting. Al Fredericks came and fixed up some lights, and that was good. Kim Campbell has been doing the same thing, so we're a little bit more lit in the building next door. And that's rather wonderful. I've been doing a lot of office work, and that's handy. I wanted to say something about the pocket prairie. People look at a pocket prairie at this time of the year and think there's a bunch of weeds, because most of the Park District plots are cleaned up because it's in the end of summer, and fall is there, and there's a workforce to do that. And once again, it doesn't look interesting to have dead frosted plants. So they're bare beds instead, but some of those creatures are interesting, and especially the native ones. So I've been out, and you walk into the pocket prairie, and you see the trees without their leaves. You see the snow, the little trail that the scouts put in for us, the conservazione area where people can sit and enjoy. A little trail going around. You can see the remains of the fruiting bodies, the monarders, the lead plant, the packed down grasses where you know that they will form the organic matter which has made this region so wealthy. It was on good soils coming from Canada, but the little pocket prairie was a dump, a place where you paid so much to dump your bricks and glass and things you didn't want. So it's not the world's greatest prairie soil, but the organic matter starts to make it work. So there's a little trail, and there's you can see the compass plants and the dock, and then you can go out and look down on the plants in the street side of the Pocket Prairie, and there's rosinweed and stiffleaf goldenrod and the seeds of Baptisia, and the Baptisia plant is there, and they're all empty because the seeds are a legume seed, and they're kind of really nutritious, and so they go early. But the remains are there. Just the little blue stem, the Culver's root, and so I took some pictures of that area, and we'll include some of that in the TV and YouTube version of this program. And let me have a look at my thing here. Oh. There were crows. I didn't look up rookeries, but the crows decided there were two trees on the Pocket Prairie, and there must have been hundreds of crows on one tree. And I looked around, and there were crows in the air, and there were crows sitting on the roof of the old railroad station, and there was a tree beside there, and it was about dusk, and they were all talking to each other, and then they would fly out and fly in, and it was cold, and I wondered how those creatures survive in the cold on the top of a tree. And I suspect that the numbers give a little bit of warmth, but certainly they're community-oriented, and they're rather intelligent, our crows. And we talked about the guano they leave, and certainly after the snow is gone, I will see guano under those trees. They seem to settle on different trees at different times. So, Urbana had a problem with crows outside the courthouse, and there were a couple of trees there. Eventually, they took down the trees, but that just sends the crows in other directions. And we talked last week about the need to keep planting trees because early subdivisions put in trees that grew quickly, and then they get to the point of falling over in 50 years' time. So you have to plant trees that are more permanent, like oaks and the like. But the city did wash off all the guano on Park Street, and I suspect that the crows will find a new rookery. Vis-a-vis the same topic, there used to be a rookery on North Cunningham. It was just where Perkins Road takes off, and before there was a small mall there, that was a lot of trees, and it was a rookery for all manner of birds. And then that got taken down for a mall. All those birds moved over to Busey Woods, and so it was a riot over there for a while. And you don't know whether these birds are migratory birds or whether they're permanent. Sometimes you have birds like robins, and the robins that were here go south, and the robins that were north come here. So they're not necessarily the same robin. Interesting. You should watch it, and should talk to the crows. They're rather interesting. It's winter in the U.S., but it's summer in Australia, and I have been sending out a card or two, and we have a report. I see one here that we've been handing out, but we have an electronic version of it, which I've been sending out. And pleased to do so, but I talk to people as I send, and so I've been sending to a previous school captain for Holston Agricultural High School, where I went to school. And so I have been back and forth with Lex Sewell, and he's Alexander, and I find that the a little bit like the Biberman situation, where the background name probably comes from Scotland, but Lex was school captain on the football team and a prominent high school citizen, and we've been remembering our friends and relatives. Interesting territory. I don't know whether I'll get through it all, but it was a school that was rather unusual. There are a couple of schools in New South Wales. The Farrer is one, Helston is another. There's another one in Queensland, and I think there's a Dookie College somewhere. These are all high schools that catered for people who were too far away from school to go to high school. So they're boarding schools. There were other boarding schools that weren't agricultural schools, but there was an early feeling that agriculture was needed, and Helston Agricultural High School was near to Sydney in those days, and was encouraged by a Governor Macquarie. So I was thinking to tell you something about Governor Macquarie. He was an interesting fellow. He was Governor of Australia from 1813 to 1821. This was so I'll try and put the high school in context of convicts that didn't come to the U.S. anymore, learning how to do agriculture on very poor soils, and they some of them starved. So there was a governor before Macquarie. He's Bligh, and he was subject to some revolts, and so Lachlan Macquarie grew up in the New Hebrides, which is way up north of Scotland, and he had a family background. They were leaders in their day, and he joined the army, and it was a foot army that he belonged to. He was in various theaters of war. He was even with the Revolutionary War, and he'd been in quite a number of countries, including India. He was appointed to Australia, and did very well. He was especially careful to handle convicts who would be using up their term, and when they finished their term, they would become citizens, free people, and there were also settlers. The settlers weren't quite so keen on the convicts being released in this manner, but Macquarie was very helpful with the convicts, and he also had to face the fact that there was very, very little food, very little agriculture. So that's where the Helston Agricultural High School came in. It was in a suburb of Sydney eventually, and it was named Helston after the surveyor's wife's maiden name. And so there is now a suburb of Sydney which is called Helston Park, and a private school occupies the territory. But Lachlan Macquarie had a lot to do with encouraging early agricultural practices. They worked with Aboriginals. He was fairly dramatic as far as if the Aboriginals cooperated, that was good. But if the Aboriginals destroyed their fields and did damage to their cattle, then he would summarily treat them very poorly. And that was the tradition of the day. They would do things like hang people and leave their bodies round as a warning. But in actual fact, the first convict group that came to Australia was so ignorant of any practices on very poor soils, and the Aboriginals treated them in a communistic way, a very friendly way. They shared their food. They taught them how to survive. So it was difficult. The coastal plain is basically leached sedimentary soils lifted out of the ocean, and so slates and shales and sandstones were the name of the game. They could not get over the escarpment and go west, although Macquarie encouraged that, and a group called Blaxland, Wentworth, and Lawson eventually got over the Blue Mountains to the slopes and plains to the west. This rise was just high enough to give some rain, so there were rivers, and Macquarie set up governmental things. The Macquarie Street in Sydney is still the street where the government for New South Wales meets. Its buildings are still used. There's a recognition of Macquarie everywhere. There are Macquarie rivers. There are Macquarie. There's also a Lachlan River using his first name. He encouraged people to be Christians, so there are churches that were in places like Windsor, probably about 40 miles from Sydney. If you were emancipated, then you got to be a Christian if you behaved yourself. So there were probably more Christians than there were originally. He had some opposition from the early legitimate settlers, and so he was checked out by people coming from England to do just that. And he was kind of laissez-faire. He went by his own rules, whereas the Commonwealth at that stage was much more prone to be organizing things from England. So he was a bad boy from that point of view. He had to deal with bushrangers and the like, and had a military group that didn't always win. My brother is in an area called Canoundra, and the bushrangers would do things like come to the ball and steal all the horses that were outside, or steal the women. It was just the bush rangers were highly intelligent. They just had a real thing to test the mettle of the military that Macquarie was in charge of. So, okay, I'll go back to Macquarie Fields and Glenfield, where the high school was. It was moved from the what is now somewhat the center of Sydney. This was a small colony with a little tank stream that ran into the harbour, and so it was moved out to where you could have enough, perhaps 1,000 acres of land for agriculture, and the school took on a lot of different people. A number of the people were Bernardo orphans from England. And they would do well and survive. Sometime later, it was found that some of these children were not necessarily orphans, but there were people who came from stations where their parents owned a lot of land, and so I went to high school with children who could go to the Royal East to show and buy a bull or do responsible agricultural things. You have to be somewhat amazed at that. A number of us could not go anywhere else but to a boarding school, because it would have taken us, if I left home on a Monday morning, I would have had to take a service car for 10 miles and then change to another bus and get to the railroad station and take the Brisbane Express to Coffs Harbour, and I'd be arriving halfway through the day. I'd have to board for the week and then do the reverse on Friday afternoon. That was kind of an impossible situation. My father was a small one-teacher school teacher in the boondocks, so it was high school. And a lot of my friends and relatives at school were of that ilk, who were far away from a high school opportunity. We ran the farm, or farmers ran the farm, but the principal was in charge of a boarding facility as well as a school facility. There were about 200 boarders, and there was a matron, Miss Olrenshaw, and her mother, and a group of, at my stage, immigrant people from Europe. They were maids for the cleaning up of the bedrooms, and also for working with the kitchen. So we would be on squad. So on squad meant that you either had to look after the cows or the pigs or the horses or the chickens. And so if it was cattle, you might have to get up at 3 in the morning and bring the cows in and look after them. You had to know how to milk, and many people, especially if they were from the inner suburbs of Sydney, that's another group of children that were there. They were on scholarships often. You had to know how to work with a cow. A cow just doesn't give you its milk willingly if it's treated badly. So you had to take the cow in, feed her. So there were silos with food. That was another squad making silage. The cows were fed well. They were fed according to the milk that they provided. If you provided a lot of milk, you got a little bit more food. But it was the sort of thing where you needed to know to scratch the cow behind the ears and be friendly with her, and she let her down her milk. And so neophytes who had never milked a cow before didn't know to do that. So the deputy principal, Mr. Cook, would be there to see that you did the right thing by the cows. And when you finished, you would sit around a fire and got slabs of bread, and you had dripping from the kitchen, which was flavored with salt and pepper, and you. I don't know what this did to your metabolism, but yes, I'm thinking of a bile that treats your fat. But this was a very nice thing to do after you'd finished milking 30 cows. The horse people would come across and join. The horses were another thing. You had to know that Billy was not awfully friendly, and you didn't need to get in contact with his hoof. You perhaps combed him down from the top of the stall. It didn't pay you to do that, because Billy decided you were weak and wet, so you had to move into Billy and do things so that you had confidence. But I saw the deputy principal once do that, and he ended up across the yard because Billy didn't like what the vice principal was doing. But there was equipment. There were friendly horses. Floss knew exactly what to do with kids. They could back her up in the cart, and she would be very, very friendly. It's just, and then there were the hog people, and pigs are really very clean animals if you give them the chance to be so. And they had concrete pens and with sprays where they could get to be cleaned every once in a while, but they had also places where they could wallow. And that is also a very important thing for a pig to do, because they would get lice and insects on them. And so wallowing allowed you to get rid of that sort of thing. And once again, the pigs were very friendly. Sometimes you could actually take a big sow that was used to being handled, and you could ride on her. It was, and you would have 6, 8, 10 young ones farrowing, and you would have to make sure she didn't roll over on the young ones, which sometimes happened. So you had farrowing pens with a ridge around so that the young ones could suckle without problems. There was always a little runt, because not all the teats on a sow are equal. And so if you were a pig that wasn't aggressive enough to get the best teats, then you might be not growing quite so well. Let me say that there were sheep too, and there was actually one of the courses at the Health and Agricultural High School was shearing and wool classing. So many of the people that were there were from stations where they had to deal with wool. The Australians ran until there was plastics. Ran on the back of sheep. Merino sheep came from Spain and other places. They had various eras of wrinkled bodies, so that the idea of a wrinkled-bodied sheep was that it had more surface area, so you had more wool. The only problem is that when you got to Australia and there were lots of blowflies and other creatures that got into that smegma in the valley of the wrinkle, then you got disease. And so shortly you had to make sure that to breed the sheep to have a fairly tight skin. And if it wasn't tight, especially on the buttocks, you would crutch the buttocks. They would take a sliver of skin out of each side of the buttock so that it would be tight and wouldn't catch a lot of dung there. So these were the sorts of things that were taught. You learn to run a harvester. And create the fields or paddocks of pasture that were needed. You also had to learn how to butcher animals. So you had to be able to select a sheep for butchering. One classic situation, somebody selected the prize ram, and without realizing that this was the genetic part of the sheep flock, and it was destined for the dining room, and it wasn't very. It was a very gamey meat, but it was an accident that became a legend. And then you had chickens, and a lot of chickens, and a little bit of research, because next door to the agricultural high school was a veterinary school, and it was a veterinary research station. And one of the interesting things that they were trying to do was to see if they could combine chickens and turkeys, breed them. It wasn't really successful, but it was an experiment. It was called a turkey, and they had hoped to have a turkey. Nearby there was a top school. The top school was up the hill a little bit, and it was for people who had mental challenges. But it also had orchards, and the evil-minded children would sometimes invade the orchards and come back with cherries and other fruit and vegetables. So it was a wonderful place to grow up in. You got to be fairly independent. There was a hierarchy. The sirs, or the seniors, were in charge of the juniors. You had a prefect system where the seniors would have a dormitory with 10 or 12 younger students. If you needed to have your football clothes washed, then the senior would look for a junior to do the job. It was very public, and you got to share with each other a lot. You got to know where the various people came from. And when it came to the vacation, at this time of the year, the high school is vacant because it's a Christmas vacation, at least 6 weeks. And people would go home, and you would try to get out of there early. And Heck, and I'm trying to think of Heck's other name, but he was the sports master, but he was also in charge of distributing free tickets for the trip home. And he would wait till the train left so that you didn't leave too early and get into Sydney and wander around and get into difficulties. So a lot of growing up there, tennis, courts, and a system of corporal punishment that involved a good deal of caning if you did things like took off to the Georgia River and went skinny dipping, which was sort of supposed to be out of bounds because the school was in loco parentis. It was in charge of children and it has responsibilities. So you could get punished for going to the river and swimming, and the reason for skinny dipping was that if you got caught, one of the evidences was a wet pair of swimming togs. So you made sure you didn't have wet swimming togs. And growing up at Hurlston was rather wonderful. Just up the road was Macquarie Fields, and on the Macquarie Fields there was a Macquarie House. And that's where it was a retreat, I assume, from Governor Macquarie at some stage. There's a little creek ran round in front of it. And those areas are now getting developed. So they're taking this high school and moving it to be part of a Hawkesbury Agricultural College. Hawkesbury Agricultural College has now become a red brick university. And it's Hurlston already has become co-educational, and so has the college become co-educational. It's Western Sydney University, and taken on different disciplines, nursing and teaching, and so it's not just pure agricultural college. So I taught there for a while before coming to the U.S., and one of my thoughts was I had the advantage of going to the University of Sydney, which produces 4-year research agriculturalists and 3-year more applied sort of agriculturalists. But there's the sort of people that have physics and chemistry and basic sciences, geology and botany and veterinary medicine, and there's a gap between that person and the person at the applied agricultural college that was then that I was teaching in. And one of the things I was wanting to try and do with the aid of visual material was to narrow the gap between the academic University of Sydney and the more applied college, especially in things like chemistry. There's a tendency at the college level to give you rote information you remembered. So if you went out to a farm and you had to look at the agristology of the plants, you knew exactly at that time what was there. And the alternative for the academic agriculturalist was to look at that field and say, I don't quite know what's there. I'll do some research and I'll come back in 3 months and tell you what it is. So the college people were very popular in terms of extension of agricultural ideas. The difficulty was that as the years rolled by, the rote learning people weren't as able with their mathematics and chemistry and physics and botany to be able to adapt to a new situation. So there was a fairly huge gap between the two. I wanted to combine art and education and science. I have an agricultural degree, a 4-year agricultural degree. I found it a little hard to do here because the degree of sophistication of something like biochemistry here was rather serious, and I didn't have the mathematics, physical chemistry, the background that was necessary for doing that sort of work. So over the years backed off of that a little bit, but I have been rather happy to be working with WEFT to do some of these things. So we're taking this radio program and converting it to a visual program, and those visual programs are rather important because often the visual is worth 1,000 words, and we do that. And so I'm doing some of the things that I came here to study and to do, and I'm doing that with prairie preservation, which is very much in this area an endangered ecosystem. But you have to give credit to Helston Agricultural College for doing that sort of thing in the first place. I'm looking at them.
12 minutes.
So let me tell you a little bit more about the school. You would be in a dormitory with 10 beds in the same room, 10, 12. You would have a prefect in charge. You would wake up, go to breakfast. You had to be on time. The dining room was huge. It had 22 tables with benches. You didn't have chairs. It was benches. And it was a fun and communal place to be. Dormitory 22 would talk to somebody else. That people would walk around, and it was the end of wartime and kind of frugal. But there was a library nearby. People would come with their football clothes on, and so it was very relaxed. And the teachers would be at a teacher's table on a dais at the end of this room, which is probably 60, 70 feet long. And there would be wags that would be doing things. The kitchen, if you ran out of butter, somebody was designated to go to the kitchen. So sometimes you went to the kitchen for more of something. So the food was good. It was not a lot of fruit, so sometimes there was a question about that. Sometimes the people who didn't like what they were given would rebel. Some people didn't like beetroot, so they would put that on the end of a knife and bing it onto the ceiling, and that sort of activity didn't please the matron. So she was good at. She would come and she would push back all the plates and take the offending student, bend him over the table, and whack, whack, whack. So this was what you grew up with. Sometimes there was a steamed pudding that didn't go down very well, and people would mamp it into little balls and throw it up against the wall outside. But generally speaking, this was a very interesting school to be at. And the matron had a greenhouse. And in the greenhouse, there were interesting plants. And one of them I can remember was a plant that smells like meat, and it attracts flies that are interested in that sort of smell. And some of these were plants that only flowered once every 2, 3, 5 years. And so Miss Orenshaw and her mother were from England and had an English background, and we used to handling children. There was a hospital, and you went to a hospital call at night, and it might be 2 aspirins now and 2 when you go to bed, or it might be that there was a small hospital that took in people who got various problems like measles, and you didn't want measles or mumps or chicken pox or scarlet fever to be moving around the school, and we were all very close together. There were day students, and the day students would come in, and they had difficulties. They had to come from long places, or a long way, and you had to sympathize with them because they had to get on a train and go home every day. Some of them would come for the week and go home for the weekend. Some were able-bodied people who were playing football in their home communities on the weekend and coming back to school. So the varying degrees of maturity. There was a small army unit, so you could belong to a junior army, just the same way as you do here. And some of those people would end up in army situations. And there was a little local train that could go by. We didn't have watches, so you would be asking someone, did the 9:30 go through yet? And you know the time. The war ended, and I can remember the last train that came through on that day was hosed down. Just a kind of a friendly riot. The end of World War II with Japan. There was some of these people had relatives that had really lost out in the Middle East and in Japan. Some of them had walked the Burma Trail, and so the ANZACs, the Australian and New Zealand National Services, were well known for having survived, and so there was a lot of respect for the military. There was a small community nearby, and it had a post office, and everyone knew the 2 people who ran the post office, 2 sisters, and the McGee family, and there were churches around, and we were all had to go to church on Sunday unless you had some sort of dispensation from that. And so now that school will become a set of schools in that region which has developed. And the school itself in the 1920s, or 2020s, will go to be with the Western University that it used to be the Hawkesbury Agricultural College. It's settled very near to the escarpment with Hawkesbury River running by, so that's the name of the Hawkesbury Agricultural College. And there are fields that are on the alluvium, and the alluvium is a little more rich than the surrounding territories because it gets some leachate from volcanoes that are on that escarpment. There was one plate tectonic moving over another. In my day, I was teaching chemistry, and it was an all-male institution. There was a serious initiation process. Some of the people that came to that college were the sons and daughters of, or not daughters, sons of people who were leaders in their countries, and there was a difference between the plebeians and the non-plebeians, and so one of the aims of the initiation was to bring people to the same sort of level. Some people didn't handle it. The high school would do the same sort of thing, and they'd leave. But there was an organization amongst the seniors where there was a king of Motting and a queen of Motting, and there was an organization that went with it. And so students that were recent arrivals would be taken out onto the Oval and early, and the sprinkler would be put on them for a while, and there's just physical things were kind of demanding. They would, if somebody was rambunctious, they would do something like put them in a sack and put them on the railroad line that was next to where the train was, and that would be rather scary. So this sort of institution was a signature for the children and the grandchildren, and it was an institution. And so if you were at the agricultural college, you'd been through this sort of initiation. When they took on women, that was a difficulty. So what do you do with women? I had a cousin that was there, and he wasn't impressed by what was happening, and so he and his associates decided to challenge what was happening. And I think in the long run, two of them got married, and so there is a history to this sort of institution, a very British type history in a way.
1 minute.
Oh, yeah. Okay. But the high school and the agricultural college together, I think, is very helpful. And it's about 40 miles from Sydney, and it's still rural enough that it can survive as an agricultural community. Still using horses, I think. They used to have a drive that took you from the railroad station to the college with a horse and charabanc, and so there's that sort of tradition, and that's what I grew up with, and that's what I came here with. And at this time of the year, I think about that, and I think about some of the people that I grew up with, that included Lex Yule, who was a school captain at that school, and interestingly, the prefects and the school students were very much a part of the administration of that school. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial, and Happy New Year.
Dave on the board. And Dave trying to get a word in edgewise. Dave on the board. Let's see. The views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.